Well, hi everybody, it's Mr. T here, and this video today is setting the stage for the American Revolution. So we have just studied the signing of the Declaration of Independence, which is essentially the beginning of the American Revolution, the beginning of the United States of America. So in this video, we're going to review briefly, and then we'll talk about some of the important figures that led to this American Revolution. So let's start off with a little review and answer the question, how did we get here? How is it that on July 4th, 1776, a group of colonies decide to be free of Great Britain and to take one of the biggest risks in, honestly, the history of the world and fight for their independence? So we studied that after the French and Indian War, Great Britain started to tax and impose a lot of economic sanctions on the colonies to pay for that victory in the French and Indian War. And where we left off as far as major events was the Boston Tea Party. All right. Now, after the Boston Tea Party, we had the Intolerable Acts. And the Intolerable Acts were essentially punishment for what the colonists did during the Boston Tea Party, right? So it was punishment, and the main part of it is that they closed the Boston Harbor. In 1774, after that, the colonies are deciding what to do, and they formed the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia, and they pledged not to start a war, but to continue the boycott. A few months later, in 1775, the first shots of the American Revolution are fired at Lexington and Concord. And it's called the Shot Heard Around the World. And at that point, the colonies have to decide, okay, what is the next step? So they begin training a militia to fight, selecting George Washington as their leader. And in May of 1775, they convene at the Second Continental Congress. And they try one more time to do what is called the Olive Branch Petition, which is one last chance at peace with Great Britain. Doesn't work. And so that's how we get to July 4th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence, the ultimate breakup letter in history, where they state all of their grievances. They say that every person is born with unalienable rights, and because they're not being protected, the 13 colonies are now the United States of America. So if you want to know why the revolution started, it's really the phrase, no taxation without representation. And the big part is laws were being put on the colonies, and they had no representatives, no members in parliament, and they were taxed without consent or permission. Now we're going to begin talking about some of the important figures that led to the American Revolution, and we put them into four categories. So we have government leaders, we have speakers, we have military leaders, which we won't see a lot of those yet because we're not into the major battles, and then we have writers that influence the thinking of the people in the colonies. So let's start off with the person that's considered the villain in this American Revolution, King George III. He's the monarch of Great Britain during the American Revolution, and although the colonies tried to speak up, he repeatedly ignored their petitions and requests for any type of representation or say in the government. It is essential to the freedom and security of free people that no taxes be imposed or forced upon them, but by their own consent or their own representatives. And that was from the Sons of Liberty. The leader of the Sons of Liberty is Samuel Adams, okay? And he's known as the bad boy leading up to the American Revolution. He led the group called the Sons of Liberty. And what are they famous for? Well, they're famous for a lot of the demonstrations, particularly the Boston Tea Party. Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. Those are the words of Patrick Henry, also known as the Smack Talker. He gave one of the most famous speeches in American history. He served in the Virginia House of Burgesses. And his fiery "Give me liberty, give me death" was a rallying cry for those seeking independence in the colonies. Volumes have been written on the subject of struggle between England and America, and the period of debate is closed. I challenge the warmest advocate for the reconciliation to show a single advantage that this continent can reap by being connected with Great Britain. But the injuries and disadvantages are without number, and our duty to mankind at large, as well as to ourselves, instruct us to renounce the alliance. Everything that is right or reasonable pleads for separation. The blood of the slain, the weeping voices of nature cries, 'tis time to part. Okay, those are the words of Thomas Paine from a famous pamphlet called Common Sense. And if you've ever heard the phrase common sense before, it means something that you should know. And he wrote that it was common sense that people should want to be independent from Great Britain, and it was time. Now, how do I remember him? Well, he was a pain in the neck to the British because people read his pamphlet, and after they read that book, they were crying out for independence. All right, and so there is the important piece of writing from Thomas Paine. Let's look at John Adams. John Adams was a political philosopher, second president of the United States. So he's going to come in a little later in our study of U.S. history. Why is he important at this time? Well, he helped edit the Declaration of Independence, so he was an important part of it. So Jefferson wrote the majority of it. But he's famous because he was the lawyer for the British Redcoats after the Boston Massacre, which none of them were convicted for the crime, but later becomes a very prominent patriot. The final important figure of the time period leading up to the American Revolution is Abigail Adams. And she is famous for her quote, "Remember the ladies." Okay, so remember during this time period of the 1700s, women did not have much of a voice. They didn't have really, essentially they had the rights of children. And so they didn't have much of a role in society. She was the wife of the second president of the U.S., who we just looked at, John Adams. She was politically influential. And she wrote lots of letters. Particularly, she asked him to remember the ladies in the Declaration of Independence. So she was one of the early advocates of women's rights. Now, if you know anything about the historic events and knowing how long it took for women's suffrage, voting rights, you'll know that the men in that room did not listen to the idea of remember the ladies. But the fact is that she started that movement for female rights in America. So hopefully you have a pretty good understanding of the people who were important leading up to the American Revolution. Best of luck on the questions about these people and the events leading up to the revolution. Have a great day, guys.